And we've also got questions coming in from our online participants.
Hi, Melanie Teff from UNICEF UK. I wanted to ask the panellists if you had any sense from your research or from your contacts with communities as to what percentage of the people's decisions for where they're headed relates to trying to reunify with family members, and whether people are aware of any of the legal routes that exist for being able to reunify with family members, or whether those legal routes either don't exist or just don't function in practice, so people turn to smugglers rather than trying to go through legal routes.
Heaven, would you like that one for the point of view of family members? And
yeah,
such?
I mean, I think the very clear finding of our research was not necessarily being able to say something substantive about the proportions of people, but rather that family reunion was a very important aspect of people's decision-making, particularly in the so-called Eastern route, in terms of people who were at the end of 2015, beginning of 2016, who already had family members living in European countries and for whom reuniting with those family members was one of the key factors that shaped where they wanted to go. And many also talked about the difficulties of being able to do that in any formal way, or feeling that it was possible, but that would take years, literally years. And so that wasn't enough to make them think it wasn't worth taking the risk, in a sense.
While you were travelling, Ahmed, did you meet people whom you came perhaps from your country, or people you'd actually been next to while you were travelling? Did they talk about families? Were they worried about that they'd been split up? Was that part of it?
Well, there are two things. Some of them had no family members whatsoever in Europe. Some of them were children sent by their families to Europe so they can later on come on a family reunion visa. And others, they had one or two members of their families, in one of the EU countries, that they wanted to go there and join their families. So you have kind of a wide range of different motives of why people were moving.
Yeah. And would you think, Dr. Liu, that keeping families together, which is one of the arguments where you have large gatherings in refugee camps, but they actually lead to their own problems, is that a priority of keeping families together?
Well, I can't really answer that question because this is not really part of our mandate as MSF. The thing I can say, though, is the fact that it was very clear to us that a lot of people in despair of reaching out a safer place will use the policy of family reunification. Mm-hmm. And then one of the stories that stays with me when I was in Samos is about a woman, a mother, and then she was talking about her children, and all of a sudden I always thought that she had 3 children because we've seen her in our clinic, and all of a sudden she talked about a 4th child, and I said, oh, wait a minute. I said, you have a 4th child? She said, oh, well. And then she looked at me, and then she said, well. And then finally the story goes that basically she sent her 4th daughter on her way, and then basically her hope is it's going to be easier for her to be smuggled. It's going to be easier as well to find a way, meaning that she's probably going to sell her body to get all the way to the northern of Europe. And then her final and utmost hope is there's going to be family reunification at the end of that awful journey. So this is what people are ready to use. And as a lot of people, the panelists have been saying, people are creating their journey as they are going along, as they might see possible opportunities, if you can call it this way, because I don't think it's really opportunities, just to outsmart what is going on.
Thank you. Question there. Yes. Microphone, gentleman in the middle.
Hi, thank you so far. This is a fascinating discussion. I'm learning a lot. I wanted to ask, I'm Mark Galloway from the International Broadcasting Trust. So one of our interests is media coverage. Ahmed, now that you're living in the UK, there's such a lot of media coverage of migrants and refugees, but do you feel that some of the points you're making are actually coming through? And how could we be more effective? You know, we've got organisations like UNICEF who have very good media access. How can we be more effective in getting some of these key messages across?
I was part of a BBC documentary called Exodus, Our Journey to Europe, the 3-hour documentary. And it went like, it was shown here in the UK, in the US, and beyond, you know. And I think one unique thing about that documentary was the story of 5 up to 7 people. They were not talking about 65 million people. When you make it personal, it becomes very, very powerful. I was not talking about, you know, these 65, you know, faceless figures. I was talking about Ahmed, an English, you know, student who did Shakespeare, and, you know, he did Chaucer and the Renaissance and Victorian, so people could relate that we are not different. It was a doctor, it was a, you know, an English teacher, it was a mother, you know. So when you make it personal, you know, and again, it breaks the bridges. People can relate that. Well, they're telling that they're invaders and they're rapists or whatever, which is not the case, you know. So I think it is very important, you know, when it comes to representation, you know. I remember going to many places, for instance, about where there were events and conferences talking about Syria or the migration crisis, and there was not a single Syrian present, you know. There's some conference talking about the future of Syria, and no Syrians involved. You know, and people talking about the refugee crisis and the movement, and there's no single refugee. I mean, I don't know what is the logic, but again, but on the other hand, there were a lot of events and initiatives. You know, when people who make the journeys, you know, were involved, were invited, because having their, you know, insight is vital. I mean, you cannot say I understand how difficult the journey is because you never did it. You read about it, you watch it on TV, but you've never been through it, because the details, like my journey was about 2 months, 55, you know, days, includes a lot of, you know, stories of smugglers and police brutality and people and you know, strangers' kindness. So it's very important, you know, to include the person, you know, to include these people and engage them, because if you keep them away, you know, it's not going to solve the problem.
Well, there's a question coming online which follows on rather from that, from Gianmarco Trenna of the Sorgo Foundation, who asks, are there any recommendations here as to how to influence positively citizens' perceptions of refugees in Europe? What are the main drivers that influence that? I mean, right at the back of this, you know, is the fact that there is, in most of the countries we've talked about, strong, popular, local feeling, which may be both helpful or very, very unhelpful. How do you influence in the way that you would influence it?
I can try and answer that on the basis of some work that my colleague Helen Dempster did here at ODI. I would agree with you, Ahmed, that those stories are extremely powerful, but I think the problem is that not everyone watches these kind of stories. So I'd say, you know, I'd love for the people who live near me, who have their pro-Brexit posters and their England flags hanging up, to be watching documentaries like that, but we know they don't. And what recent research on public perceptions of migration has shown is that people are not strongly pro or anti-migration, but that they can be classified into several groups. And migration or messages about migration need to be specifically targeted at those subgroups. And some subgroups might respond better to hearing very specific stories. Other groups might respond better if you tell them about the economic benefits of migration. So the answer is that these responses need to be localized. They need to be very, very targeted.
Well, that's difficult for any nation.
Yeah.
Costs money.
Yes. Joanne.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, but I think that there's two things that happened in terms of migrants that somehow went viral. Everybody remember the washing of a little alien on the beach, and everybody remember the CNN footage on auction of African people in Libya. So somehow well, it went viral, and then this is when Macron said something got to happen. This is inhuman. So the thing is, there is something that even if there's something about if you don't create an emotion, and if it doesn't shock people at this stage, very little will work. We've been trying to use the rationale of saying all the migrants, refugees are not in Europe, guys. Doesn't work. We've been telling them, no, they're not, like Hamid said, they're not rapists, they're people fleeing for their life. Doesn't work. We've got all the data, we've got all the statistics. Rational argument doesn't work. We're in the world that rationality doesn't work anymore, unfortunately.
Can I say, just one point from my experience, that it is extremely rare that something which figures, even when it figures very much in Western Europe's media and has an emotional base to it, which is something both moving, which everybody talks about, rarely moves a government. It is a myth that the media tip governments into direct action. And so that's, having been through a number of them and a number of fairly well-known episodes, that's the experience.
And that is really one of the difficulties that we're working within, and I absolutely can relate to Joanne's point about, feeling somewhat despairing of how you start to engage with this when you present evidence. And we did so all the way through the project. I mean, we were very determined with this particular piece of research not to present the evidence kind of 2 years down the line when the project concluded as now, but rather from the beginning of the work, really feeding these kinds of, the complexities and the challenges to the narratives in right from the beginning. But I think the bottom line is, and it's back to why you put migration crisis in brackets, is that attitudes to migration are not necessarily about migration. I mean, migration is a touchstone issue for a whole raft of other things. And the problem with migration policy, a bit like the problem with migration politics, is if you just then focus the solution on migration or dealing with the consequences of migration or addressing people's anxieties about migration, you lose sense of the broader context of concerns and anxieties that migration has come to represent. So somehow we've got to it sounds ironic, but I think it's very true, is to move the debate away from migration. Now, most people are saying we need to talk about migration more. Personally, I've talked about it a lot over the last 25 years, and so have a lot of other people. And just talking about migration as a specific narrow topic doesn't really do it. But talking about what it is that migration represents in terms of changes in community, anxieties about, let's call it globalization, but shifting working patterns, anxieties about conflict and security. To me, it seems that those are the context within which migration both occurs, but also within which attitudes are formed. And so in a way, taking the debate away from just migration could take some of the political heat out of the politics and stop politicians using migration as an excuse for lots of other things that they do, which is what we're seeing.
Anybody else on that? Or can we take another question from the floor? Yes, here. That's right.
Just to carry on this discussion, because Heaven is, I'm Sara Pantuliano from ODI as well. Heaven is absolutely right. We have been trying to present evidence on these issues now for a number of years, and we've been going nowhere. And the problem is not just influencing the public, it is indeed influencing the political leadership that hides behind the public. Joanne said it very eloquently. Migration is unbeatable. Look at your panel. Everybody on your panel, perhaps with your exception, Katie, is a migrant or a refugee, including whoever's migrated to Italy. I'm a migrant. Migration is a reality of the world. And, governments know that. You can contain it. Containment doesn't work. Investment in developing countries is not going to stop migration. They know that very well. But it is a way to sell something that in their minds appeases the public, and diverts attentions away from other issues. In fact, I see a lot more maturity from the business community, trying to engage with this issue much more intelligently around some of the labor requirements that Europe does have, for instance, and encouraging migration, against some of what the political leadership does not. But to me, the crux of the issue is how do we incentivize the political leadership to have the courage to champion, to engage with issues in a different way. And that's where we're failing collectively as experts on these issues.
can I take another question? And it's just behind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel. My name's Dalia Ranki from the Norwegian Refugee Council. Just a question slightly different, more about the migratory routes. What does the panel think about what humanitarian and even development actors should do in terms of response to be able to do it in a humanitarian principled way and to avoid the potential of complicity with upholding migration policies to prevent people from being refugees, being migrants and moving?
Right, who would like to take that one on first?
Well, I think that in all the crises nowadays, humanitarian are being co-opted, like it or not. That is what. And then the thing is you have to decide as an organization how much you want to be co-opted and be co-opted for people, and then being co-opted to striking the balance that is going to be more for the people you're trying to help than for the authorities of government or whatever. And I think for me, the dilemma, we face it on a daily basis everywhere. And the worst place we're facing it is actually in Libya, because we're working in those detention centers. And then people are being starved, people are being abused, people are being tortured. And then we do first aid, and then when they're very, very sick, we send them to hospital. And then what I said in the press conference I've given in September was saying, at one point I was asking my people, my team, I just said, how far are we going to go? If we don't speak out, we are becoming the enablers of those policies. And then for me, the only thing we can do now is to make noises about things. And if we don't make noises about what is going on, then I think we are being fully, completely co-opted.
Yep. Thanks. I think my experience, has been a unique one, because when it comes to the humanitarians, there's always somewhere there in Africa or in Asia, they're faraway land. But today, the crisis is here in Europe. And I think one of the unique experiences with the Greek refugee crisis was it showed how inept sometimes the humanitarian section is. The corruption, the resources. I mean, I was reading one report. They said about they sent. About more than 50% of the funding was wasted, completely wasted. I remember where people were on the move, in Macedonia and in other parts of Europe, it was not the big names, it was not the big guys on the ground responding. It was the grassroots who responded, and there was a massive movement of grassroots, because we understand, for the case of UNHCR or big names, they cannot go to Calais or Paris because funding, you say that you're independent or whatever, but it comes to funding, if the government is not happy, it means that you've got funding. So I think this is one of the things, when it comes to the humanitarian. At the same time, we've got a rise in the business sector, intervening or coming into the humanitarian field, that, okay, we are ready to help you with apps, with beautiful tents, that gets cold in the summer and hot during the winter. So we're seeing a competition, because for many of these people, it's a great opportunity. It's an opportunity.
As we've talked about, a lot of funding is going towards stopping flows that are in Europe, and some of those are disguised under the heading of protection, but essentially they are still about stopping flows. And my gut instinct as a researcher, and knowing the other evidence on this topic, was this is not going to work. But if you look more closely at some of the interview data, if you look at Heaven's finding that most people don't intend to come to Europe in the first place, also interviews we did with Eritreans and Ethiopia, you'll find that people do initially try to make a future there. So if some of that money is being spent towards improving conditions for people there, for opening up schooling, for their opening up access to education for their children, and also improving labor market opportunities for people, that could help to improve the lives of people and potentially stop them from making risky and dangerous journeys. Not all of them, but some of them.
Well, there's a question here from Fontini from Lesvos saying, But what about the people who already live in the host communities? Isn't it important to have their views represented? It says, we tend not to get mentioned. That's the assumption that the host community is going to agree with matters of education and supplying jobs. How do you do that? Is it important that the host communities themselves have a say?
Yeah, it is. Of course, it's important, but I think it comes back to my last point actually, that one of the problems with migration policy is they're oriented towards the problem of migration, and therefore the group that's defined as being either problematic or in need, and we have this very sort of simplistic dichotomy between the two. And in most communities, what you'd want are policies that address the community within which there are also people who are migrants and refugees. Now, there are exceptions to that where people are in camps, and unfortunately in Lesbos, of course, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people being prevented from moving on, and so therefore you have people effectively stuck on Lesbos, which is not an island that's necessarily able to provide the kind of opportunities for integration that might exist elsewhere in Europe. So, you know, it has to be a whole community approach. And one of the problems, and it comes back to the kind of politics of this, is that communities are being set against one another. So it's not just refugees and migrants who are marginalised in a lot of this. There are many other communities that are being marginalised. And then they're positioned against one another in terms of access to resources. And I think just going back to some of the points about the humanitarian question, yes, humanitarianism is important. And yes, providing opportunities for people is important. But rights are also important. And in a lot of this discussion, we lose sense of the rights-based approach in all of it, that some of these other things that we're talking about stem from having rights in the first place. So if you give people rights, the things that flow from that, like access to education and opportunities for their children, for example, come from that. But I have to say I agree with the question that's come in, that this needs a whole community response if we want to have any kind of real sense of either integration on the one hand or tackling some of these political and other scapegoating, for want of a better word, that we're seeing taking place.
Joanne, did you want to come in on this?
I just wanted to add, and I agree with what you're saying. I think, and thank you very much, for the question on host community, because I think it's key. And then if people are integrated, and if people are welcome, that makes a huge difference. And I think what is going on, and one of the things we've been facing in Jordan, is the fact that we have been able to get a price. For example, this is a simple example, but we've been able to get a cheap price for pneumococcal vaccine for people in crisis from the big pharma. So it's going to be $5. And so basically right now, Jordan government can vaccinate the Syrian refugee for $5, but have to pay between $70 to $80 for Jordan children. And so what is the consequence of that is they're not vaccinating anyone. So yes, host community matters.
Any more questions from the floor? Do we have any hands? Yes, over there.
Hi, I'm Shiva from Red Eye UK. And we talk a lot about host communities and integration, but how often do you think these refugees that come in are integrating? When are they ever, they do eventually become accepted, but when does that integration need to stop to preserve their own culture? And I can see from Jack's Ahmed's Twitter handle, he's got @Jack Ahmed. Are you also is that a way of you integrating as well?
Using to escape the security services back in Syria. So it has nothing to do about integration, sadly. So yeah, would it be okay to go ahead with the question? Yeah, Jack name is something, Facebook, everything was fake name, because in Syria, if you get caught, you're gone. So I think integration is a very important subject, and I think the coming decade will be, a lot of debate will be about integration, because integration means different things to different people. What is integration? I see it somehow different from other people, So, and again, I was reading an article by an Iranian, former refugee called the ungrateful refugee, and she presented a great argument there that, and why we're supposed to always just to be grateful to these people, when will it end? Is there a timeline? Will they stop being, being a refugee, what is the timeline, and this idea of, integration, as I mentioned, and going back to the idea of host community, integration does not work one way. It's a two-way, process. That if I am living in a community and the community is not supportive, does not understand my problems and my issues and my mental health problems and my history, it's not going to work. If I go to the butcher, if I go to the bus driver, to the teacher, to the university, and they do not understand it, it's not going to work, And for sometimes, integration works for some people, and you find them, they're doing great, they're integrated. But I found some people who've been living in some country for over 50 years, and they never integrated. They cannot speak a word of the language. Not everyone is going to integrate. It depends on the country and the support that the government is putting. If you're cutting the funding for language classes or whatever, it's not going to work. And again, don't forget the trauma and this idea of identity, because sometimes you assume that you're asking people to give up on their identities and transform into a new thing, which is not going to happen. I've met many English friends who came to Iraq, for instance, and the only place that they would go, it would be a place where all the Brits sit and talk and celebrate. They do not mix sometimes with the host community. So why assume that others should come and integrate while we just go as expats, whatever. So it should be both ways.
I'm going to bring this to a close by asking all of our panelists to give me one practical thought about improving the situations we've heard about. One practical thought. I'm not saying a solution, I'm saying a thought. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first, but I'm not sure that I have it's not a solution, but I think it's where we need to start, and we need to change or open up the political space, because what we've seen over the last few years, but actually this goes back more than 20 years, is a narrowing of the political space within which to have a conversation about migration. And for us, bringing evidence to bear on that so that people understand that what happens is part of a bigger geopolitical and social process of transformation that is kind of normal at one level, albeit accelerated by technology and other things we see. Political leaders could be much, much braver. And if they were, we might see a slightly different picture or story of what's happening.
Okay. A practical thought.
I would say that we need to go down to the micro before we can design policies at the macro. And what I mean is that we need to understand how people make decisions, why they come, why they move on, how they understand policies, what their perceptions of family reunification are, for example. Do they even have any knowledge of these policies, or do we just make assumptions on this? And then once we have that information, we can design policies that actually reach people.
I think for me, the focus should be also to put a lot of pressure, and so not only pressure, but support the hosting governments wherever, because at the end of the day, we are a human being, we're living in the 21st century, we need rights. The solution should be based on rights. So give people access to work, to education, to citizenship or whatever, just make them feel that they are humans, they are not subhuman. So making the rights-based, debate at the center or at the heart of the debate is very important.
Well, the last one to go. Well, I would say that we need to tell our government what we think, and then I know I'm Canadian, and I'm actually French Canadian. I look so much French Canadian. But the thing is the fact that we need to go and tell them that we don't want our public money to increase the suffering of people who are fleeing for their life or for a better life. And I think that government will listen because their eyes is on the next election. And if we tell them loudly enough and a lot of people together, they will listen because they want to be reelected. So they're going to try to please us. And I do not believe that, citizens don't have a voice. We have a voice if we collectively bring it together. Canadians, we rarely go in the streets. We went only once in the street, and it was to protest against Iraq war. And you know what? We didn't go.
I'm going to bring it to an end because we have run out of time. Thank you to our panel. To have informed opinion, to have research, to have experience, all the things which bring reality to any sort of question, and a complex question which all of Europe is faced with. And I think it's been a privilege to listen to them this evening. Thank you for your questions. Again, it's important, I think, that people do question, do wonder where we're going, do want some more ideas, because the situation at the moment, as we've been hearing, is one which, and going back to your original central word, is one of questioning our humanity, that has to be addressed, and by all of us. Thank you to the ODI for hosting this. Thank you to the people online for joining us. And keep an eye on odi.org for further upcoming events. And for those of you, and I have no doubt there will be many, who want more to say, who want to ask questions, well, we're all going to gather in the next room for a reception. So please join us and let us give a round of applause to our contributors.